It was another busy evening at the restaurant, the kind where the air was thick with the chatter of guests and the clinking of glasses. The waitstaff moved swiftly, weaving between tables, their footsteps light yet purposeful. Among them was a woman who on the surface seemed to blend into the crowd. She wore the standard black uniform, the apron tied neatly around her waist, and her movements were efficient, almost mechanical. But if you looked closely, you'd notice something different about her. When her fingers brushed the edges of the plates she carried, they seemed to linger, almost as if they were longing for something more than the task at hand. It was in the way she hummed under her breath, a tune that would come and go with each step. Few noticed, but to those who did, it was clear she wasn't just a server. She was someone who had a secret, a talent that had once been the center of her life but had since been buried beneath the weight of responsibility. When she was younger, music had been everything. It was the rhythm of her childhood, the one thing that made her feel truly free. She remembered the first time she sat at a piano, her small fingers awkwardly pressing the keys, unsure of what they were supposed to do. But soon enough, the notes started to make sense. And just like that, she was hooked. Hours would slip by as she played, losing track of time, her fingers dancing across the keys as if they belonged there. But life, as it often does, had other plans. As she grew older, the demands of reality began to take over. She didn't have the luxury of pursuing her dreams without consequence. The need to earn money to help support her family became more pressing than the quiet calls of a piano. So she pushed it aside, choosing to work in places like this restaurant where the tips were decent and the hours long. But even as she served meal after meal, a part of her remained with that piano, somewhere far away. Tonight, as she moved between tables, her mind wandered back to those days. The guests were polite, most of them too caught up in their own conversations to notice her presence. But one man sitting alone at a corner booth caught her attention. He was older, his face weathered with age, but there was something about him that seemed different. His eyes were sharp, observant in a way that made her feel like he was taking in every little detail around him. She approached his table, ready to take his order. But as she leaned in to speak, she caught a glimpse of something that made her pause. He was humming, the same tune that had been in her head all evening. It wasn't a popular song, something from an old classic, something that most people wouldn't have noticed. But there it was. The man's voice was low, almost imperceptible over the noise of the restaurant, but to her it was like a signal. For a moment, time seemed to slow down. She felt an odd pull, something that made her want to stop and listen. But she quickly shook herself out of it and asked what he'd like to drink. "Just water, please," he said, looking up at her. His eyes twinkled as if he knew something she didn't. "But I have a question for you." She raised an eyebrow, unsure of what to expect. "Yes, you were humming," he said. "The same song I was humming. I've never heard anyone else hum that tune before. You play the piano?" Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure how to answer. It wasn't that she was ashamed of her love for music, but she had become so used to hiding it. The idea of someone asking about it, especially a stranger, felt like an intrusion into a part of herself she had long kept tucked away. But his voice was kind, genuine, and she found herself nodding before she could stop herself. "Yes," she said softly. "I used to. I haven't had time for it lately." He smiled, his eyes studying her intently. "What happened?" he asked, his tone not demanding but curious. She hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. She wasn't one to share her personal struggles with customers, but something about this man made her feel comfortable, like he wasn't just another patron. "Life happened," she said simply, shrugging as if it was no big deal. "Bills to pay, people to support. There's just no time for something like that anymore." His gaze softened and he leaned back in his seat. "I understand," he said. "But you know you shouldn't give up on something that brings you joy. I can tell it's still in you." She laughed softly, more out of embarrassment than amusement. "It's been years. I'm just a waitress now." He didn't reply immediately, but his eyes never left her face. It was as if he was searching for something he couldn't quite place. Finally, he spoke again, his voice steady but with an underlying intensity. "I'm hosting a private event at my home next week," he said. "An art show, actually. But I'm also inviting a few musicians. If you'd like, I could arrange for you to play. Just for a small crowd, nothing too formal. What do you say?" Her mouth went dry. For a moment, she thought she had misunderstood him. "You want me to play?" she asked, barely able to get the words out. He nodded, a small encouraging smile on his lips. Yes, I think you have something special. Don't let it go to waste. She stood frozen for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. This was the last thing she expected. An opportunity, a chance to perform again after all these years. The thought of sitting at a piano again, playing in front of people, terrified her. She hadn't done that in so long, and there was so much doubt in her mind. But beneath the fear there was something else, something that stirred inside her. Could she really do it? Could she still bring the music to life? She looked at the man, trying to read his expression. He seemed sincere, but was he really serious? I don't know. She started, but he cut her off gently. You won't know unless you try, he said, his voice soft but confident. You've got a gift. Don't hide it away. She couldn't stop thinking about his words. You have a gift. Those simple words echoed in her mind long after her shift ended. She was so used to being just another face in the crowd, another worker in a restaurant full of strangers. But now someone had noticed her. Not just her uniform or her ability to serve drinks and take orders, but her deeper self, the part of her that had once been so alive with music. For the first time in years, the thought of playing again began to tug at her heart. She had tucked that part of herself away so carefully, wrapped it in a layer of doubt and fear, but now she couldn't ignore it. That part of her, the part that had always been drawn to the piano, to the beauty of music, had suddenly resurfaced. And it wasn't going to fade away so easily. The invitation he had extended was still fresh in her mind. A private event, an opportunity to perform. At first she had almost laughed it off. Who was she to play for a group of people? To expose her talent again after so many years of hiding it? She had long since convinced herself that she was simply a waitress now, nothing more. But what if he was right? What if this was her chance? That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The soft hum of the city outside her window did nothing to calm her racing thoughts. She thought about the piano, the one she hadn't touched in so long. She could almost hear the keys beneath her fingers, feel the familiar weight of the piano stool beneath her. It seemed impossible to imagine herself playing again. But the idea refused to leave her. The next morning, as she prepared for her shift, she found herself filled with a mix of excitement and dread. The restaurant was busy as usual, with the lunchtime rush bringing a wave of new customers. She moved quickly, delivering orders, clearing plates, and taking payments, but in the back of her mind, the invitation kept resurfacing. She couldn't shake the feeling that this might be something more than just a random offer. It felt like fate, as if the universe had conspired to give her a chance to reconnect with her passion. But she also knew the fear that came with it. What if she wasn't good enough? What if her skills had atrophied over the years? What if she made a fool of herself in front of strangers? These were the questions that gnawed at her, doubts that seemed impossible to quiet. And yet the thought of never knowing what could have been, that was even worse. That evening, after her shift ended, she found herself standing outside the restaurant, the cool air brushing against her face. She took a deep breath, her thoughts a whirl of uncertainty. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for, or if she was even ready to take the next step. But somehow, deep down, she knew that if she didn't at least try, she would regret it for the rest of her life. Later that night, after another long day of work, she found herself sitting at her small apartment desk, staring at the piano keys in front of her. The piano, which had once been a source of joy, now seemed almost foreign to her. It had gathered dust over the years, and she had long since stopped trying to keep it in tune. But tonight was different. Tonight she was going to play. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, feeling the coolness of the ivory beneath her touch. A faint sense of nostalgia washed over her, reminding her of the many nights she had spent lost in music. She closed her eyes and began to play, tentatively at first, but gradually with more confidence. The melody flowed, and she found herself swept up in the music once again, forgetting everything around her. For a few brief moments, she was no longer a waitress. She was a musician once more, a creator of something beautiful. But the reality of the invitation was never far from her mind. What if she wasn't good enough to perform again? What if she embarrassed herself? She paused, her hands hovering over the keys, and the doubt crept back in. The piano, which had once been a source of comfort, now felt like a test, a challenge she wasn't sure she was ready to face. It was late when she finally stopped playing. The music still lingered in her mind, but so did the anxiety. She knew she couldn't go on like this. Playing only for herself in the quiet of her apartment. The invitation had given her a glimpse of what could be, but now it was up to her to make the leap. She had to decide whether or not she was willing to take that chance. The next morning, she made up her mind. She called the number the man had given her, her hands shaking as she dialed the number. It was as if the act of calling sealed the deal, pushing her into a new reality. "Hello?" a voice answered. I'm calling about the event," she said, her voice shaky. "I'd like to accept your invitation." The night of the performance arrived faster than she had expected, and with it came a rush of emotions she couldn't quite control. She had spent the last few days practicing as best as she could, squeezing in a few hours here and there between her shifts. The thought of performing still felt surreal, like something that belonged to a version of herself she hadn't known in years. But here she was, standing outside a mansion, the building towering before her like a scene from a movie. The heavy iron gates opened and she walked in, her nerves buzzing through her veins. The event was already in full swing when she arrived. Inside, the house was elegant, every corner carefully curated with art and antiques. The air was thick with the sound of soft conversation and clinking glasses. She felt out of place among the polished guests in their fine suits and dresses. But the moment she stepped into the grand hall, she was greeted by a warm smile from the host, the same man who had extended the invitation. His kind eyes were full of encouragement. "You made it," he said with a genuine smile, taking her coat from her and leading her further inside. "Everyone's eager to hear you play." Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected such a warm reception, but it only made the weight of her nerves heavier. As they moved through the room, she couldn't help but feel like an imposter. The guests seemed so sophisticated, their conversation so refined. What would they think of her? A waitress who had stepped onto this stage after years of silence. She tried to shake off the doubt, but it clung to her like a shadow. The piano was positioned at the far end of the room, its sleek black surface gleaming under the soft lights. The moment she saw it, a rush of both excitement and fear surged through her. It had been so long since she had played in front of anyone, let alone a group of strangers. She had only ever performed for herself, alone in her apartment, her music a private escape from the world. "You'll do great," the man said, sensing her unease. He patted her gently on the shoulder. "Take your time." With a nod, she made her way to the piano. The room seemed to quiet as she sat down, and she could feel the eyes of the guests on her. She adjusted the seat slightly, feeling the weight of her palms on the cool ivory keys. Her fingers hovered over them for a moment, and she took a deep breath, trying to calm the racing thoughts in her mind. "You can do this. Just remember why you're here." The music was waiting. She closed her eyes for a moment, tuning out the world around her. The notes she was about to play weren't just for the guests or for the man who had given her this opportunity. They were for her. A chance to rediscover a part of herself she had almost forgotten. When she opened her eyes, she felt a calmness wash over her, and without a second thought, her fingers began to move. At first, the music was slow and hesitant. She wasn't sure how it would sound, or if her hands could still remember the fluidity they once had. But as the first few notes filled the room, something magical happened. The familiar feeling of the keys beneath her fingers began to take over, and she was transported back to the nights she spent playing for hours, lost in the music. The nerves began to fade, and all that remained was the rhythm, the melody, and the joy of creating something beautiful. The guests watched in silence, their attention fully on her. She could feel their gaze, but it didn't feel judgmental. Instead, it felt supportive, as if they were rooting for her to succeed. She continued to play, the music flowing more freely now, each note more confident than the last. She wasn't just playing to impress anyone. She was playing because she loved it. The joy that had been buried deep inside her for so long was bubbling to the surface, and she couldn't stop it. As the song came to a close, a sense of relief washed over her. She opened her eyes and looked up, half expecting the guests to look away, but instead she was met with a room full of smiles and applause. It wasn't loud, but it was genuine. The man who had invited her approached her first, his eyes shining with admiration. "You were amazing," he said, his voice full of warmth. "I knew you had it in you." For the first time that night, she allowed herself to smile, the weight of her self-doubt lifting. She hadn't just played for the guests, she had played for herself. And in doing so, she had reclaimed a part of her life that she had almost forgotten. The evening continued, and as the night wore on, More guests came up to her to compliment her performance. Some even asked if she would be willing to play again at future events. She was overwhelmed, but in the best way. It was as if a door had opened to a world she had never thought possible. And for the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. As the event began to wind down, the host came to her one last time. "Thank you for sharing your gift with us," he said, his voice sincere. "I knew you were meant for more than just waiting tables." Her heart swelled. The words, simple as they were, meant more than she could express. She had always seen herself as just a waitress, but tonight, she had reminded herself that she was so much more. She was a musician. She was someone who could still create something beautiful. Someone who could share a piece of her soul through her music. As the evening ended and the guests began to leave, she stood by the door, watching them go. She was exhausted but happy, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. The world she had once known, the one where she was just a server, seemed so distant now. She had stepped into something new, something full of possibility. For the first time in years, she felt like she was starting over, and this time she was ready. The days after the event passed in a blur, each one feeling more surreal than the last. She returned to the restaurant, her daily routine seemingly unchanged. Yet inside, everything was different. She still worked the same hours, carried the same trays, and greeted the same customers. But now there was a quiet confidence in her that hadn't been there before. The music, once a buried part of herself, now lived within her in a way that felt more real than it had in years. Each time she passed the piano in her apartment, she would pause and run her fingers lightly over the keys. She had played in front of people, strangers no less, and they had seen her, truly seen her. It was a feeling she had never imagined she'd experience again. It was as if the performance had unlocked something deep within her, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. The man who had invited her to the event had been true to his word. Not long after, he had called her again, offering her more opportunities to perform at future events. At first she had hesitated, the old fears creeping in. What if she wasn't good enough? What if the first time had just been a fluke? But then she remembered the applause, the way it had felt to play. She remembered the connection to the music, the way it had poured from her as if it were a part of her, something that had always been there, waiting to be set free. The doubts still lingered, but they were easier to push aside now. She was ready. She couldn't keep hiding from herself anymore. Soon she found herself playing at more private events, small gatherings, intimate concerts for those who appreciated the art of music. Each time she performed, she felt a little more at home. But it wasn't just the music that changed her. It was the way people began to see her, not just as a waitress, but as a musician, a person who had something to offer beyond the job she had taken out of necessity. One evening, after finishing her shift, she received a call from the man again. This time his voice was more serious, less casual than before. "I have something special coming up," he said. "There's a gala in a few weeks. It's a big event, a fundraiser for a local charity. I want you to perform." Her heart raced. The thought of playing in front of a large audience made her stomach tighten. A gala? A fundraiser? This wasn't just another small private event. This was a whole new level. I don't know if I'm ready for something like that," she said, her voice unsure. "You're more than ready," he replied without hesitation. "I've seen your talent, and I know you're capable of something great. You've already proven yourself. You just need to trust yourself." His words were a balm to her lingering fears. Trust herself. It was what she had struggled with for so long. The doubt, the feeling that she wasn't enough, had held her back for years. But now, she knew deep down that the only thing holding her back was herself. She had the talent, the passion. All she had to do was believe in it. After hanging up, she stood there, staring at the phone in her hand. The nerves were there, of course, but beneath them was something else. Something more powerful. She felt alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. The thought of performing for a crowd, of stepping onto a stage and sharing her music with them, was exhilarating. The days leading up to the gala were a whirlwind. She practiced more than she ever had before, determined to make sure everything was perfect. She wanted to do more than just perform. She wanted to give everything she had. She wanted the music to speak for her, to show the world that she was more than just a waitress. As the night of the gala approached, the excitement started to build. She was nervous, yes, but there was also a sense of pride in what she had accomplished. A year ago, she had never imagined that she would be standing on a stage, performing for a crowd of people who admired her. And yet here she was on the cusp of something she had dreamed about for so long. When the night finally arrived, she found herself standing in front of a beautiful grand piano, surrounded by glimmering chandeliers and elegantly dressed guests. The room was filled with the hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. It was everything she had imagined, everything that had once seemed impossible. The gala was more than just an event. It was a celebration of her journey, a testament to how far she had come. She stepped up to the piano, her heart beating loudly in her chest. As the first few notes of the song filled the air, the world seemed to fade away. The nerves, the crowd, the grandeur of the event, they all disappeared. It was just her and the piano, her fingers moving over the keys as if they were a part of her. She played with everything she had, pouring every bit of emotion and experience into the music. The guests around her were silent, their eyes on her as she performed. And for the first time she felt no fear. When the song came to an end, the applause was overwhelming. She looked out at the sea of faces, each one filled with admiration and respect. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel out of place. She belonged here, in this moment, doing what she had always been meant to do. After the performance, the host of the gala approached her, a broad smile on his face. "You were incredible," he said, his voice full of pride. "I knew you had it in you." She smiled back, the weight of her journey settling into her bones. She had done it. She had stepped out of the shadows and into the light. And the world had responded with open arms. After the gala, things changed in ways she hadn't expected. It wasn't just the increased number of invitations to perform at private events, nor was it the growing respect from those around her. It was something deeper, something within herself that had been ignited. The days blurred into weeks, and with each performance, she found herself becoming more confident, more connected to the music. It was as if the music had been there all along, waiting for her to remember it, waiting for her to truly feel it again. The restaurant, though still a part of her routine, began to feel more like a fleeting moment in her life. Her shifts, once filled with the monotony of serving and clearing tables, now seemed like the background to something bigger. She no longer saw herself as merely a waitress. She had become someone more than that, a musician, a woman who had reclaimed her voice and her purpose. And with each performance, she was more determined to keep walking down the path that had opened before her. But even as the invitations grew, so did the pressure. The expectations of others weighed heavily on her. The more people asked her to perform, the more she began to question whether she was truly ready for the world she was stepping into. This was a world of critics, of artists who had honed their craft for years, and here she was, a woman who had spent most of her life tucked away behind the anonymity of a waitstaff uniform. It was on a quiet evening after a particularly intense performance that she began to doubt herself once again. She sat alone in her apartment, the piano before her, but the music seemed distant. Her fingers rested on the keys, but nothing came. She had played so many times, each time giving a part of herself to the audience, but tonight, it felt like there was a wall between her and the music. The notes didn't feel right. Her hands, which had once moved with such confidence, now felt uncertain. Was she really good enough? Had she fooled herself into thinking she was more than just a waitress? The doubt crept in slowly, insidiously, and she found herself questioning everything. Was she only doing this for the applause? For the recognition? She had spent so many years hiding her talent. Had she only wanted to prove something to herself or to others? Her mind spun with uncertainty, and the familiar feeling of inadequacy began to creep back in. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear the knock at her door. When she finally opened it, it was the man, the one who had first given her the chance to perform. He had become something of a mentor to her, guiding her through the world of private performances, pushing her to take risks, and encouraging her when her confidence wavered. He stood there with a smile on his face, as always, but there was something in his eyes that made her pause. "I know you're busy," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "But I wanted to talk to you." She gestured for him to sit, still unsure of what he was doing here. It wasn't unusual for him to check in on her, but tonight something felt different. She took a seat on the couch, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, not sure where to start. Maybe I'm not really cut out for all of this. Maybe it's just a fluke and I'm not as good as everyone thinks. He looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he shook his head slowly. I've seen you play, he said. I've seen what you can do, and trust me, you're not just good enough, you're incredible. She looked down at her hands, still resting on her lap. But sometimes when I sit down to play, it doesn't feel the same. The music doesn't come as easily, and I don't know if I can keep doing this. What if I'm just fooling myself? He leaned forward, his gaze firm but kind. You're not fooling anyone, least of all yourself. You've spent your whole life hiding your talent, telling yourself you're just someone who waits tables, but you're more than that. You've always been more than that. You don't need to prove anything to anyone but yourself. She felt a lump rise in her throat as his words sank in. For the first time in days, the doubt seemed to loosen its grip on her. Just enough for her to breathe again. Maybe, just maybe he was right. Maybe this wasn't about proving anything to anyone. Maybe it was about her finding the courage to be herself, to embrace the music that had always been inside her. Do you want to hear something? She asked, surprising herself with the question. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to play for no one but herself, to play for the joy of it, without worrying about the judgment of others. He nodded, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. I'd love to. She stood and walked to the piano, her fingers brushing the keys. She hesitated for just a moment before she began to play. This time there were no expectations, no need to impress anyone. She played for herself, for the simple joy of making music. The notes flowed freely, and for the first time in what felt like ages, she lost herself in the rhythm, in the melody. The doubt faded away, replaced by something deeper, a sense of peace, of belonging. When the song ended, she turned to find him watching her, his eyes filled with admiration. That, he said softly, was beautiful. She smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in days. Thank you, she whispered. The conversation shifted then from doubts to dreams. He spoke of future performances, of opportunities that could take her beyond the private events she had been playing. He encouraged her to think bigger, to not limit herself. But for the first time, the pressure didn't feel as heavy. She realized that it wasn't about performing for others. It was about finding her voice again and sharing that with the world. That night, as she sat back down at the piano, she felt a sense of clarity. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a woman with a gift, and she wasn't going to hide it anymore. It didn't matter if the world accepted her or not. What mattered was that she had found the courage to be herself. The weeks following her breakthrough were some of the most transformative of her life. With each new performance, the once dominating fear that had held her back began to dissipate. The nerves were still there, lurking in the background before every show, but she had learned to manage them, even embrace them. They were a part of the process, a sign that she cared deeply about the music, about giving the audience something real. Her life had changed in ways she couldn't have imagined a few months ago. The restaurant, which had once been her entire world, now seemed like a distant memory. It had given her the stability she needed when she was younger, but now it was just a stepping stone to something greater. She had found a purpose beyond the apron and the orders. Music had become her language, her voice. She had spent so long hiding behind her uniform that it felt strange to step into the world as the woman she was always meant to be. One afternoon, after another successful private performance, she received a call that she wasn't prepared for. The man, her mentor, the one who had given her the chance to perform at that first event, was on the other end of the line. His voice, usually calm and reassuring, held a note of excitement she couldn't quite place. "There's an opportunity," he said, his words quick, almost breathless. "A real opportunity for you. I've been talking to some people, and they think you're ready for something bigger. A professional performance, a concert with an orchestra." Her breath caught in her throat. A concert? An orchestra? It felt surreal. The idea of performing with a full orchestra, something she had only dreamed about when she was younger, was more than she could grasp. She sat down, the weight of the words sinking in. "Wait, are you serious?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never been more serious," he replied. "It's a big step, but you've earned it. You've put in the work and you've proven yourself. I'm offering you the chance to perform at a venue that's renowned for hosting world-class musicians. You'll be the headliner." The words echoed in her mind as she processed what he was saying. Headliner. The word sounded foreign, too grand to apply to someone like her, someone who had once been content to play in the quiet of her apartment. out of the sight of others. She had never imagined herself as the center of attention, let alone on stage with a full orchestra behind her. "Are you sure I'm ready?" she asked, still trying to wrap her head around it. "More than ready," he assured her. "This is your moment. But you have to make a choice. It won't be easy. There's a lot of pressure, and it'll require you to push yourself further than you've ever gone before." She thought for a moment, her mind racing. Could she do it? Could she step into the spotlight like that? Could she perform at that level, with an entire orchestra backing her? It felt overwhelming, but at the same time it was everything she had ever wanted. The dream that had once seemed so distant now felt within reach. But it was more than just the chance to play on a grand stage. It was about proving to herself that she could go beyond the limits she had set for herself. It was about finally trusting the gift she had kept hidden for so long. "I'll do it," she said, the words coming out more confidently than she felt. "I'll take the chance." The decision was made. The months that followed were a whirlwind of rehearsals, preparation, and self-doubt. She spent long hours practicing, pushing herself further than she ever thought possible. She had to learn new pieces, complex compositions that challenged her in ways she had never experienced. The pressure was intense, but she welcomed it. She knew that this was the next step in her journey, and she was determined to rise to the occasion. Despite the overwhelming tasks ahead, there was something else that she struggled with, the fear of failure. Even as she practiced, there were moments when doubt crept in. What if she couldn't handle the pressure? What if she messed up in front of the orchestra, in front of the audience? The thought of making a mistake on such a grand stage was terrifying. But the more she practiced, the more she realized that these feelings were a part of the process. Everyone felt nervous before a big performance. It was how you managed those nerves that made you a true musician. As the day of the concert approached, she felt a mix of excitement and fear. She could see it in her mind. The grand hall, the orchestra tuning behind her, the audience waiting in anticipation. It felt surreal, as though she was stepping into someone else's life. But this was her life, her moment, and she knew that there was no turning back. On the night of the concert, everything came together. The venue was breathtaking, with its towering ceilings and intricate chandeliers that cast a soft glow over the audience. The orchestra was already in place, the musicians poised and ready. She stood backstage, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. She was about to step onto a stage she had only dreamed about, and she was about to perform in front of an audience that would expect nothing less than perfection. Her heart raced as she took her first step into the spotlight. The applause was deafening, a wave of sound that washed over her, making her feel both small and important at the same time. She walked to the piano, her fingers trembling as she touched the cool ivory keys. The conductor gave her a nod and the orchestra fell silent. It was her turn. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and then began to play. The music filled the room, the notes flowing from her like they had always been there, waiting to be released. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was telling a story, sharing a piece of her soul. The orchestra behind her played in harmony, creating a sound that seemed to wrap around her, supporting her every move. As the music swelled, she felt a surge of emotion. She was no longer the waitress, no longer the woman who had doubted her worth. She was a musician, a person who had found her voice, and she was sharing that voice with the world. The music was everything, her past, her present, and her future, all woven together in a performance that she would never forget. When the final note sounded, there was a moment of silence before the audience erupted into applause. It was thunderous, filled with admiration and respect. She stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, overwhelmed by the experience. She had done it. She had taken the chance, and it had paid off. Backstage, the man who had given her the opportunity stood waiting for her, his face beaming with pride. "You did it," he said simply, his voice full of admiration. "I did," she replied, still in awe of what had just happened. "I really did." The journey that had started with a small, hesitant performance had led her to this moment. She had stepped onto the stage, and she had proven to herself that she was more than capable. She wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just a musician who had come out of nowhere. She was someone who had worked, struggled, and fought for this moment, and she had made it hers. As the evening drew to a close, she stood in the wings watching the last of the guests leave, their faces filled with awe and admiration. She had made her mark, and for the first time in her life she knew that this was only the beginning. The applause from the concert still echoed in her mind days later. It wasn't just the loud clapping or the standing ovation that she remembered. It was the feeling. The feeling of being seen, of being heard in a way she had never known before. The music had connected with something deep inside of her, and the audience had felt it. It had been the performance of a lifetime, but it wasn't just the culmination of months of hard work. It was the beginning of something new, something bigger than she had ever imagined. After the concert, everything seemed to change. She found herself inundated with more offers than she could have ever dreamed of. The phone calls, the emails, the messages, all were filled with people who had witnessed her performance and were eager to have her perform at their events. It felt overwhelming at times, and yet it was exactly what she had wanted all along. The road she had been walking for so long now felt like a path laid out before her, and it was up to her to choose which direction to take. Despite the excitement, there were moments when she couldn't shake the feeling of fear that lingered just beneath the surface. What if she couldn't live up to the expectations? What if she couldn't replicate the magic of that night? The doubt that had once held her back began to creep in again, reminding her of the years she had spent hiding from her own potential. What if she wasn't meant for this world? What if she was just a fluke? But then she would remember the way the music had felt that night, the way her fingers had moved across the keys without hesitation, as if they had always known exactly what to do. The way the orchestra had played behind her, supporting her every note. The way the audience had responded to the music with pure admiration. That was the truth she had to hold on to. That was the woman she had become. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was a musician, and she had proven that to herself. Over the next few months, she continued to perform at a variety of events, private dinners, charity galas, and even a few small festivals. With each performance, she felt more comfortable in her own skin, more confident in her abilities. She had become a regular in the world of private performances, and though it wasn't the massive fame of a concert tour, it was enough for her. She was doing what she loved, and that was all that mattered. But there was still something missing. One evening, after a particularly emotional performance at a charity gala, she found herself sitting alone in her apartment, staring at the piano. The soft glow of the streetlights outside filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. The silence around her felt deafening, even though she had just played for an audience. The quiet left her with a feeling of emptiness, as though something deep inside of her was calling out for more. It wasn't just about the performances. It wasn't about the recognition or the applause. It was about something deeper. She realized that the music she had played in those private events, no matter how beautiful, wasn't fulfilling her in the way it once had. She had found success, yes, but there was still a longing, a desire to connect with something bigger than herself. She wanted to share her music with more people, to reach an audience that extended beyond the walls of private gatherings and events. She knew what she had to do. It was time to take the next step, the one she had been avoiding. It was time to share her music on a larger stage. It was time to step into the spotlight once more, but this time with an audience that would challenge her in ways she hadn't experienced before. She began to plan. She reached out to a few music agents, expressing her desire to perform in larger venues, to tour, to reach new heights with her music. It wasn't easy. There were plenty of doubts, plenty of moments when she questioned whether she was truly ready. But she had learned that readiness wasn't about waiting for the perfect moment. It was about taking the leap, even when the ground beneath you wasn't as solid as you would like. Weeks passed and the offers began to roll in. The first of many tours, the first time performing at a well-known concert hall. She spent months rehearsing, perfecting her sets and preparing for the most important performances of her career. It was a new kind of pressure, one that stretched her in ways she hadn't imagined. There were still moments of fear, moments when she questioned if she could live up to the expectations placed on her. But she had learned to trust herself, to trust the music. And when the day came for her first big performance at a renowned concert hall, she was ready. The night of the performance, she stood backstage, her heart racing in her chest. The sound of the audience chatting and shuffling in their seats filled the air. The lights above her were bright, and the weight of the moment settled over her like a blanket. It was a far cry from the intimate events she had grown accustomed to. This was the real deal. This was what she had worked for. This was her time to show the world that she belonged. She walked onto the stage, the bright lights blinding her for a moment, and the roar of the audience swept over her. She took a deep breath, letting the energy of the crowd settle into her bones. She was nervous, yes, but she was also calm. She had prepared for this moment. She had worked for it, and she knew deep down that she was ready. As she sat at the piano, the familiar feeling of the keys beneath her fingers brought a sense of peace. She closed her eyes, took another breath, and then the music began. The notes flowed easily, confidently, as if they had always been there waiting for this moment. The orchestra behind her played in perfect harmony, the sound of the strings and brass filling the space around her. She was no longer just a woman performing for a crowd. She was part of something greater, a collective experience of music, of emotion, of connection. The performance was everything she had dreamed of and more. The energy in the room, the way the audience reacted to every note, it was a feeling she would never forget. She was no longer just sharing music. She was sharing herself, her story, her passion, and in return the audience shared their appreciation, their admiration. It was a connection like no other. When the final note rang out, the applause was overwhelming. The standing ovation was louder than any she had ever heard, and the rush of emotion that hit her in that moment was something she had never experienced before. She stood, bowing, her heart full. This was the moment. This was where she belonged. Backstage, she could barely catch her breath. She had done it. She had taken the leap, and it had paid off in ways she hadn't even imagined. The world was different now. Her life had changed, not just because of the applause or the recognition, but because she had finally believed in herself. She had finally embraced her true calling. And as the lights faded and the crowd continued to cheer, she realized that this was only the beginning. The success of her first major performance at the concert hall marked a new chapter in her life. It wasn't just about the applause or the media coverage. It was about the quiet confidence that had settled inside her, the sense that she had truly found her place in the world. The months of hard work, self-doubt, and relentless practice had led her here, and now, with each new performance, she felt like she was living a life she had always dreamed of. The tour was intense. She had to adjust to a new schedule, one that had her traveling from city to city, performing in grand venues and intimate settings alike. It was exciting and overwhelming all at once. The bright lights of the stage were often followed by the quiet solitude of hotel rooms, the rush of sound in concert halls giving way to the quiet hum of the world outside. But no matter how much she traveled, how many new places she visited, the music was always there, waiting for her to return to it. It was the one constant, the one thing she could always count on. During the tour, she found herself growing both as an artist and as a person. The fear that had once gripped her before every performance was still present, but it no longer controlled her. It had become something she could manage, something she could use to fuel her passion. She learned to embrace the nerves, to let them guide her toward creating something more powerful, more real. She wasn't just playing for herself anymore. She was playing for the audience, for the people who came to hear her music and left feeling changed. But there were still moments of uncertainty, times when she questioned if she was truly ready for the demands of such a high-profile career. After every performance, there was a part of her that wondered if it would be the last. What if people grew tired of her music? What if they stopped showing up to her concerts? What if the magic faded? One evening, after a particularly grueling performance in a city she hadn't visited before, she sat alone in her dressing room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She was exhausted physically and emotionally. The spotlight had been bright, the energy of the crowd palpable, but now, in the silence, she was left with nothing but her thoughts. She closed her eyes and thought back to the days when she had first begun playing. She remembered the small apartment, the feeling of the piano keys beneath her fingers, and the quiet joy that music brought her. It had never been about the fame, the accolades, or the recognition. It had been about the music. She had played because it was a part of her, and as she sat there in that dimly lit room, she realized that was still true. The music had always been her true calling, and no amount of external validation could change that. The door to the dressing room opened quietly, and she looked up to see her mentor standing in the doorway. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there watching her with a knowing look in his eyes. She smiled faintly, trying to hide the exhaustion she felt. "You all right?" he asked gently. She nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. "Yeah, just tired. And I guess I'm still trying to figure out what comes next." He stepped into the room and sat down across from her, his gaze soft but focused. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice steady. "You've done things most people only dream of, and you've earned it. But the road doesn't end here. It never does," she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I know, sometimes I feel like I'm not doing enough, like I'm always running to the next thing, always looking for the next step. And what if it's never enough? What if I'm not enough?" He smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "You've already done more than most people ever will. You've put yourself out there in ways that most people never could. The fact that you're questioning yourself means you care. It means you're human. But you don't have to keep proving yourself to anyone." She looked at him, her eyes searching for answers. "But how do I stop? How do I let go of that fear that it won't last?" He paused for a long moment, considering his words. "The fear never goes away. But that's not the point. It's about what you do with that fear. It's about learning to keep going, even when you're scared. You can't control what people think of you, or how long your career will last. But you can control your love for the music. As long as you hold on to that, you'll always have something real to give." His words resonated deeply with her. She had been so focused on the future, on the pressure to keep climbing, that she had forgotten why she had started this journey in the first place. It had never been about the fame or the accolades. It had been about the music. The music was the constant, the thing that would never let her down. And as long as she remembered that, she would always have a reason to keep playing. She smiled, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I needed to hear that." He nodded, standing up to leave. "I'm always here if you need to talk. But remember, this is your journey. Trust yourself." As the door clicked shut behind him, she sat there for a moment, letting the silence settle around her. She thought about everything she had accomplished, the risks she had taken, the obstacles she had overcome. And she realized that she had already won. It didn't matter what came next. She had already built something meaningful, something real, and as long as she stayed true to herself and to the music, she would continue to grow, no matter where the road took her. The next few days of the tour were a blur, filled with rehearsals, performances, and more travel. But each time she sat at the piano, something inside her felt different. It wasn't about the pressure or the expectations. It was about the music, pure and simple. And when she played, she felt a connection to something greater than herself. As the tour came to an end, she found herself reflecting on everything she had learned. The fear, the doubt, the uncertainty, they were all still there, but they no longer held the power they once did. She had learned to trust herself, to trust the music. And as she prepared for her next performance, she realized that this was just the beginning. The journey was far from over. And no matter where it took her, she knew one thing for certain. She was ready. The days following the tour were quiet, almost too quiet. After weeks of performing on stage, meeting new people, and traveling from one city to the next, returning to the calm of her apartment felt almost surreal. It was as though the whirlwind of her life had come to an abrupt halt, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The silence was a stark contrast to the constant hum of the world she had just left behind. As she sat at her piano, fingers hovering over the keys, she realized that the music she had once turned to for comfort now seemed distant. She could hear the faint echoes of the concerts, the applause, and the energy of the audience, but the sound felt muted, as if it belonged to someone else. She had grown so accustomed to performing for others, to having her music validate her existence, that she had forgotten the most important thing. Music was supposed to be her own. It wasn't just about pleasing the crowd. It was about expressing herself, about connecting with something deeper than the noise of the outside world. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't sure what came next. The tour had been a success, and her career had taken off in ways she hadn't anticipated. But the excitement of it all had begun to fade, leaving her with an unfamiliar emptiness. She had always wanted to be a celebrated musician, to have her name known by people around the world. But now that she was living that dream, she found herself questioning what it all meant. Was it enough? Was she enough? The questions lingered in her mind, swirling like a storm. She closed her eyes and played a few notes on the piano, letting the sound fill the room. But even as the music filled the space around her, it didn't fill the void she felt inside. There was a part of her that was still searching for something, still yearning for a deeper connection to the music and to herself. She had spent so many years hiding behind her talent, burying her true self in the pursuit of success. The music had always been a part of her, but it had also been a shield, a way to protect herself from the vulnerability she feared. The more she played, the more she realized that her music had become a way of proving herself to others, not just an expression of who she truly was. And now that she had reached the heights she had once dreamed of, she found herself standing on a precipice, uncertain of how to move forward. It was in that quiet, lonely moment that she decided to take a step back. She needed to find herself again, to rediscover the joy in music that had once driven her. The fame, the recognition, the applause, it wasn't enough if it didn't come from a place of truth. She had to reconnect with the music for herself, not for the world. For the next few weeks, she stepped away from the stage. She turned down performances, canceled rehearsals, and focused solely on her own music. It wasn't easy. The pressure to continue her rise in the industry weighed heavily on her, and there were moments when she wondered if she was making a mistake. But each time the doubt crept in, she reminded herself of why she had started this journey in the first place. Music had always been her escape, her sanctuary. It was time to return to that place, to find the purity in her playing that had once made it so meaningful. In the solitude of her apartment, she began composing new music. It was different from the pieces she had performed on stage. This was raw, unfiltered, and personal. She poured her heart into each note, letting the emotions flow freely without worrying about what others might think. The music was no longer about pleasing an audience or meeting expectations. It was about healing, about expressing the parts of herself that she had kept hidden for so long. As she played, she began to feel a shift within herself. The music that once felt like a burden, a way to prove her worth, now felt like a release. She wasn't performing for anyone anymore. She was playing for herself, for the joy of creating something beautiful, and in that process she began to feel whole again. One evening, after a particularly moving session of composing, she sat back and listened to the music she had just created. It was different from anything she had done before, but it felt like the truest expression of who she was. It was a reflection of her journey, her struggles, and her triumphs. She realized that the music she had created was more than just a song. It was a story, a testament to her growth as a person and as an artist. That night, she made a decision. She wasn't going to return to the stage until she was ready. She would take her time, focusing on creating music that was meaningful to her, not driven by the need for validation or success. She would perform again when the time felt right, when the music came from a place of true expression, not expectation. The next few months were some of the most peaceful of her life. She continued composing, refining her sound and exploring new ways to express herself through music. She began to experiment with different genres, blending classical piano with modern elements, creating a sound that was uniquely her own. It was a time of self-discovery, and she reveled in it. She wasn't just a musician anymore. She was an artist, free to explore her creativity without fear of judgment. The longer she stayed away from the stage, the more she realized that her journey wasn't just about the destination. It was about the process, the evolution of her music, and the way it allowed her to grow as a person. She wasn't defined by the success she had achieved or the recognition she had received. She was defined by her love for music, and that was something that could never be taken away. As time passed, the phone calls and performance offers began to trickle in again. The world hadn't forgotten about her, but she had changed. She was no longer the woman who had chased after success, who had worked tirelessly to please others. She was someone who had found peace in her own voice, someone who had learned to create music for herself, not for anyone else. One day, as she sat at her piano composing a new piece,
she realized that she was ready.
Ready to share the music that had come from her heart, the music that had healed her and helped her rediscover her true self. She didn't need the applause or the recognition. She just needed to share the music with the world, to let others hear the truth in every note. She made a decision then. She would return to the stage, but this time it would be different. She would perform her own compositions, the music that had brought her back to life. It would be a new chapter in her journey, one that was rooted in authenticity and self-expression. The world would hear her music, but this time she would perform not for the applause, but for the simple joy of sharing her soul.